Welcome back, ladies and gents. Looks like it's time for another case review, and this one's gonna be pretty interesting. Right off the bat, I'm just gonna go ahead and say it. This is the worst PC case that I have ever personally built in, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's the worst case on the market, period. It's that bad. If you only take away one thing from this video, it should be that this thing is an utter piece of trash and should be avoided at all costs. With all that being said, let's dive right in. This is a MicroATX PC case that I bought from Newegg for $30. It's made by a brand called CHUWU, and to my knowledge they're pretty recent to the market. And they mainly specialize in cases, fans, and other computer accessories. Moving back to the case itself, it's a mess. First of all, I'm willing to bet this case was made in China. I would say rather proudly too. But just in case you think it's a design, don't worry, this case is Make in China. Now let's go ahead and unbox this. The unboxing is about what you'd expect for a case at this price point. Cheap cardboard, cheap foam, cheap plastic. Here's where the real fun begins. This thing is so incredibly light. Even with my weak noodle arms, I can still easily manhandle this thing. The overall build quality of this case is just not very great. It's made of flimsy steel and chintzy plastic. Now let's briefly go over all the key design elements. Starting at the front of the case, you'll find a brushed plastic front panel with a couple USB 2.0 ports, dedicated headphone microphone jacks, a reset switch, and a power button. This case does have a spot for a USB 3.0 port, however, it's simply not worthy of such a feature. Speaking of features this case lacks, the airflow is atrocious. For starters, it doesn't include any stock fans, and for a case at this price, it doesn't make sense not to include any stock fans, because now the value proposition is off the table. And making matters worse, the front panel is extremely restrictive. In reality, the front only has a 3 by 1 inch area for ventilation. The top is completely closed off as well. So even if you threw in a couple fans, this case would still be an oven. And before I get too off topic, I wanted to point out one more quirk about the front of the case in particular. As you can clearly see, this case has a 5 1/4 inch bay, but the front panel is completely solid. So, I mean, not that anyone uses a 5 1/4 inch bay, but it's still a ridiculous design flaw. Now let's move on over to the backside for a moment, which is nothing special, but hey, at least they got the phrase made in China correct, so that's plus. Moving on down, you'll see that the PCI slot covers are indeed the non-reusable kind, and I wouldn't expect anything more from this case. Taking a quick peek at the bottom reveals an extremely basic layout that doesn't even have any plastic or rubber on the bottom legs. Moving along to the sides of the chassis, we are presented with yet another irritating feature. Apparently, there wasn't enough room in the budget to include 2 thumb screws for both side panels. The vented panel does have thumb screws, however the opposite side simply uses power supply / PCIe compatible screws, which require a screwdriver. Now let's talk about hardware. In terms of the included hardware, it's sparse to say the least. All you get is an assortment of PCIe screws, motherboard screws, standoffs, and hard drive screws. And I guess now is as good a time as any to mention that there is no documentation whatsoever. So for first-time builders, have fun Googling which screws go where. Now let's talk about hardware support. As you'd probably expect, this case does not support any water cooling. And even regular case fans are limited to a single 80mm in the back and 2 120s in the front. In order to mount any 2.5 inch SSDs, you either have to screw it into the bottom of the case or to the front. Oddly enough, there's 2 sets of screws on both the front and the bottom that don't line up with the 2.5 inch SSD, so I have no idea what those are for. Now comes my favorite terrible thing about this case, the motherboard installation. So here I am, installing a standard MicroATX motherboard, the Gigabyte B450M DS3H, and just take a look at what happens. Yep, that's right. The geniuses who designed this case didn't bother leaving enough clearance between the useless drive cage and the motherboard standoffs. So this is what happens. Now if you have a mini ITX or slim MicroATX motherboard, it'll fit just fine. But otherwise, you're up the river with no paddle. And one final criticism about the case itself is that the cable management is pretty bad. The cutouts are awkwardly placed, and there's not a whole lot of room behind the motherboard tray for routing cables. Alright, now let's talk about why I wanted to make this video in the first place. I originally purchased this case to revitalize an old e-waste system that I found at the dump, but after finding out just how bad it was, I tried to return it immediately. And despite CHUWU's return policy on Newegg's website, they did something a little interesting. They emailed me and basically said that if I take down my review on Newegg, then they'll offer me 2 compensation methods. One of which requires me to purchase another one of their products, and then they'll send me a refund. And honestly, I'm not even sure what this second option is saying. Right now this case is out of stock on Newegg, and quite frankly, I really hope it stays that way. All of the reviews that seem like they're from actual people share a lot of the same sentiments that I did. And that brings me to the first main takeaway from this experience. Be careful if you're buying from this brand. In the time it's taken me to make this video, they've already changed their brand name. So there's definitely something sketchy going on with this company. And that's going to lead me into my second and final takeaway from this video. Do not buy a $30 case. Even if you're strapped for cash, it's just not worth it. Especially when there are so many great cases available in the $50 to $70 range. Look, here's 3 fantastic options right here. And these are going to provide way better performance, functionality, and longevity than anything in the $30 range. This thing right here, this is e-waste. And you know what? No, I can't do this anymore. Well, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and consider subscribing so you don't miss next year's video. Anyway, until next time, have a good one.